Warning. The following podcast contains politics, leftist politics, the whole truth, justice, American way thing. We live in a time where one has to post this. Progress is a dirty word, such as science and reason. My superheroes would weep. This podcast contains naughty language as well. Nikola Tesla once said, "If you only knew the magnificence of the 3, 6, and 9, you would have the key to the universe." Excerpt from the New York World, July 11th, 1935. Seems to me like he was up to something. Ha ha ha. Welcome everybody to DC Domingo number 33. I wanted to do this for quite some time. Sorry it took a while, but with the celebration of the Watchmen movie, many people online kind of share their stuff, and people were reminiscing about the film, and I couldn't help but say, hey, I haven't really done like a movie review. I've done commentaries of Man of Steel, Batman vs. Superman, and Suicide Squad. I still owe you guys two, one for Wonder Woman and the Justice League. But I've never really done one like a retrospective, as far as episode of DC Domingo. So I wanted to make 33 be kind of fun and kind of talk about Watchmen. I have a methodology for reviewing films that I've kind of tested here and there. And it seems pretty fair. Sometimes movies that I don't particularly care for have a high rating. And sometimes movies that get a lot of hype on cinemas get a really low rating. And I kind of compare it to, the popular opinion of film critics versus the popular opinion of audiences. So they tend to be really, really different. And I finally worked out a nice system that works. One of the things that really kind of made me happy was that, if you're in social media, you can become a social pariah by, crapping on things that you hate, or you can, be a much more positive thing and just kind of, point out bias and share your love. For instance, this is my Twitter handle. Go ahead and follow if you want to. I posted a picture of my room, and Larry Fong really liked it, because I have all the Watchmen posters, and, those are kind of the thing that I like to do. I like to share what I love, and, for celebration on, March 6th, which is the Watchmen Day 3/6, I watched the film. And I was like, I really need to do a review for it. So here we go. Ideally, I love for film critics to use the 24 categories the Academy Awards give out in order to mark off points on how well a film executes said categories. Now, because there are so many films that get panned by critics that are overlooked for such awards, and some other films that are overhyped and immediately given nominations in categories other films are actually superior at. So when viewing a film, I came up with 10 categories that boiled down to 1, cinema impact, and 2, personal opinion, or impression, as it were, to mere 1 point of each in the scale. I often find that if a movie is popular enough and creates big cinema impact, people will use this to justify it and let all the other flaws go unnoticed. Likewise, so many new film critics on social media act like Yelp reviewers and rely solely on their personal impression for the overall film. Millennials that grew up with the 90s were the rock stars, were the directors, were popular, in the way that usually they would forgive a flawed film simply because their favorite director is at the helm. So I boiled down actual directing, it's another topic, to one point. The same decade also gave us the rise of cynics. But that kind of trolling doesn't belong outside of a particular film. It's just more specific to a generation. So I included the category of sincerity. That's the fourth one. Which is meant to discern cash grab versus authentic art. Now, this part includes research online for reasons of said film was made and the attitude of the filmmakers. I've also included two categories to sound. One for soundtrack and another for sound, categories 5 and 6. So in general, soundtrack is meant to include songs that we hear outside of the film. For instance, that original Titanic song by Celine Dion really embedded into our society. And while popularity isn't necessarily a measure of good taste, a good song from a film is meant to evoke the feeling of said film into the outside world of cinema, creating a sense of belonging and making you want to see the film again. However, if a film uses a song that has been used in other films countless of times, it is a show of weakness and uncreativeness because it harkens back to many other films, and it breaks the belonging feeling to that particular film I mentioned. The category of sound also includes Foley sound work. What that means, footsteps, train sounds, ambient noise, keyboard typing, etc. Any kind of sound that requires physical objects in the real world being recorded for the scene. Sound mixing also goes into that category because sometimes voices come through clear while filming a scene, but sometimes there are giant explosions in the background, so things aren't going to be that clear. And choosing what things to show in the sound mixing, it's inherently to good taste. Selecting the right sounds coming forward in scenes with many things going on show the audience where they should be paying attention. And this also includes the score. Now, many people would say that the score should get its own section. Well, I agree. In cases where a film cannot afford a license to play a song, but just has their own soundtrack, then the score is judged in the soundtrack category, like documentaries on independent films, for example. And likewise, if a film cannot afford a score or a licensed songs, then the general sound will be used for 2 points in the secondary category of soundtrack category. I know this is kind of confusing, but it makes sense when you think about it. Cinematography is another category that is very, very important. I'm actually including here anything that is visuals, such as costumes, sets, makeup, special effects, and others. Everything that falls into the camera's eyes. The Academy Award has different sections for this. Now, if I was a paid critic and I had I had all the more than 20 categories instead of just 10 and maybe a full staff, I could include point by point, but I'm just an amateur and I got time to I don't have much time to spare. Another category is story. The story is the why, and as a film class would tell you, it is more important to show than tell. That is the key to good directing. And as a storyteller, What this means is less explanation, exposition. I know it contradicts the dumbing down of the average moviegoer, but it also means symbolism, layer storytelling, ciphers, hidden meaning, and many other techniques used by master storytellers for ages. A separate category is script. Script is the how the filmmakers chose to go about telling this particular story. How did you tell your vampire story, for instance? Most reviewers use the term plot, but that only describes the events, whereas script encompasses how those plot points were executed, going insofar as to include dialogue. You may have films with a weak story, but an engaging script, or vice versa, and discerning the balance of both requires you to know the difference. Another part is acting. Now, as someone that has worked with actors on screen and in theater, I can tell you that ensemble acting always beats standalone scene-grabbing egos, contradicting to popular media and Hollywood stardom, right? I know that the era of selfie, it's kind of predominant, but this is hard to understand for anybody who's not a selfish a-hole. While we all have our favorite actors, films are the sum of all parts. So there you have it. Those are the 10 categories that I'll be grading films on. Impact, 1 out of 1. A year prior, on May 2nd, 2008, the Iron Man movie had come out, and Marvel Studios was independently building a cinematic universe. However, on March 6, 2009, Watchmen was already deconstructing a universe of comics to the masses. The masses were not only unaware such a complexity could be possible in film from a comic book-based movie, they were also stupefied by the maturity and complexity of the Watchmen universe itself. The birth of the DC and Marvel modern movie rivalry was probably born here, because in order for the Marvel universe to develop, any challenger would be deemed as evil. Marvel fans had been acting like Ozymandias, murdering everybody online with, troll and vitriol who gets in their way with their, cancerous comments. Yet this film remains alive, much like Rorschach's Journal. Prior to the release, the screenwriter David Hayter, who is mostly known for being Metal Gear Solid's voice of Snake, pleaded online for fans to go see this film because this was the only way to keep good mature comic book movies alive. There was a boycott, apparently, because Marvel fans are suspects on this boycott. Because, they deemed that they wanted previous versions to be seen on screen. They even demand a 10-hour adaptation of it, nitpicking away at a movie for every chance they got, like seagulls eating rotten pirate corpses. These haters, along with websites already placing themselves as gods of geekdom, such as Ain't It Cool News and Alamo Drafthouse, come to mind, telling the obedient ones to follow their command and not see this compromised version of the film. The director's cut, released close to Comic-Con that very same year in the summer, and much to many people and haters, it was well received, better than the second time around. I assume it's because first-time viewers were full of rage and tended to miss out on all the giant details. A third version called The Ultimate Cut included the animated version of the pirate tale The Black Freighter, and it appeased many of these gods of geekdom. Over the years, we've heard random celebrities praise it here and there, but the only way to understand it and compare it to what everyone else was doing around that time is basically to look at the complete picture and, understand the graphic novel. To comic book fans, it was quite obvious, but it would take years for the masses who praise Marvel to notice Watchmen. For instance, this is a quote from Zack Snyder. Quote, "It's interesting. When I had my initial meeting with Christopher Nolan about doing Man of Steel, he said to me, Watchmen is a movie you made too early, because that movie was written deep into comic book culture as a way of exploring the why of heroes within pop culture. Deadpool shows that audiences have now gotten to the point where they can understand the satire of the genre. Before that, audiences were like, I'm not ready for that. I'm not there yet. End quote. Impression. Personal. 1 out of 1. A movie ahead of its time to the masses who only got into comics when the mainstream Mickey Mouse told them to do so. But a movie a long time in the making for fans of comics that even Disney Marvel's Ant-Man director calls Watchmen the ultimate cut, the Blade Runner of superhero cinemas. Now, I found this statement to be somewhat honest, because although he has said this before in the past, he hardly mentions it without the issue being brought up. It would be like me only commenting on my hobbies if people ask me if I'm being forced to come up with the closest thing that I love, right? But for me, however, Watchmen, all versions, feel like the Citizen Kane of cinema. Of cinema superheroes. I recall the beautiful scene where somebody asks, want to know about Rosebud? I tell you about Rosebud. That scene is mirrored in want to know about Rorschach? I'll tell you about Rorschach. I mean, not only do both films begin with the death of someone important, but also behind the scenes filming it, the reception has been very similar. For instance, the CGI cinematography that people seem to complain about Watchmen now looks more like a realistic actual film set in 4K resolution with higher movement and refresh rate than it ever did on cinema. For instance, Dr. Manhattan looked too fuzzy and walked kind of choppy and weird in cinemas due to the projection frame rate and less than 4K projectors. Yet those special effects made the world of Citizen Kane much bigger with painted-on glass extensions on sets and miniatures. The world of Citizen Kane was made grandiose because of special effects. For instance, the makeup effects to make Orson Welles look old in Citizen Kane were as believable as they are in Watchmen. It just counts on how much the audience are willing to say, yeah, I buy this. Now if the audiences tend to be cynics on both films, well, it could be better, but the story's hooking me in. That's up to the audience. A magician can only do so much. The audience needs to believe it. For instance, the camera angles in both films take risks. The contrast in both are sharp. The grandiose cinematic shots in both films dare to be bold and big. Both films are about the American dream in context. For Watchmen, it was about the concept of masked heroes in the age of nuclear risk, while Citizen Kane, originally titled The American, is about power by one individual dehumanizing him. Kind of like Dr. Manhattan here, right? Now, many have complained about the vignette style of scenes in Watchmen and how such scenes don't require great acting. However, the same can be applied to Citizen Kane, yet no one in cinema critique ever questioned this, because to do so would be heresy. I mean, Citizen Kane did it because many of the scenes were filmed in secrecy in what director Orson Welles called camera tests, before Hertz shut him down. And because Orson Welles took many takes on scenes as well, they had to be short and sweet. So, all I learned about Citizen Kane in movie classes as a teenager, that's the same kind of level of detail as I saw as in Watchmen as a young adult, because both to me represent the pinnacle of their genres and have impacted me greatly, to the point of having my whole room decorated with Watchmen movie posters. And, I these are movies that I watch with the whole family, whether it's a holiday or not. Sincerity of the project. 1 out of 1. Now, famous artistic British directors have a much higher, easier time in Hollywood because USA somehow still worship the British. I mean, it's kind of a weird, watered down Anglo-Saxon supremacy, you know? It's very, very off-putting. When Terry Gilliam approached the film, he wanted the end completely different. You know, he actually wanted to create an alternate reality vortex by having Dr. Manhattan travel back in time to stop himself from being created. And that would have created an alternate reality where the three protagonists become humans in our world. And the events become a thing in a comic book. Now, I mean, that would be like, you know, indigenous people all over the world adapting William Shakespeare's The Tempest, in which all British people never happened. I mean, that would be insulting to British white people, right? Who still say Shakespeare is the greatest writer, imposing their beliefs on other writers all over the world. Now, you can see why this crazy idea was even allowed to just stay in Hollywood. It was because the graphic novel was deemed as unfilmable, and Watchmen British writer Alan Moore disdained the idea of Yanks, who were profiteering from the success of the book. So any kind of a British person who wanted to come in and take a look at Watchmen could do what they wanted. You know, Gilliam had also changed the ending. Not only was he never hassled by the media, but also never by Alan Moore. You know, in fact, there's a joint interview between both of these Brits, and they seem to be happy about mocking the finished version, then discussing said inconsistencies. Now, a second British director, Paul Greengrass, wanted to make this film about the aftermath of 9/11. And instead of the Reagan-era turmoil between the USSR and USA nuclear Armageddon, you know, we would have had something kind of postmodern in the age of terrorism. Again, this was a prolonged gestation period, and no one in Hollywood deemed changing the greatest graphic novel of all time into something that wasn't. You know, no one seemed to be bothered. So when director Zack Snyder finished 300 and the opportunity came to make a good adaptation of the Watchmen movie, people were kind of pissed off because the finished product was too faithful to the book. Let me do that again. Too faithful to the book. Yeah, that is correct. It's like blaming a football striker for scoring too many goals in football, you know, soccer. Who does he think he is? Well, Snyder and team developed such a faithful adaptation, a director's cut, and a follow-up ultimate cut that has become, you know, this generation's go-to comic book movie of choice for many of us. I mean, even the current HBO series have gone on record saying they're not going to reboot the revered Zack Snyder film, and they're doing like a remix of it. So we got a very sincere film from people that love the film, but also from people who love comics and take them seriously. Now, soundtrack. 0.75 out of 1. I know. As I mentioned in the method of how I review films, using songs from pop culture into your film can be a double-edged sword. If you use a song that every wedding DJ plays, your audience might be taken out of the film because of such a commonality makes them feel aware they're sitting in a chair watching a movie because, you know, they got distracted and they're thinking of other times instead of being engrossed by the cinema itself. There are a few songs inserted here in the movie Watchmen that don't quite work, but that's because everyone else has used those songs way too often. The first one that comes to mind is I'm Your Boogeyman by Casey and the Sunshine Band. It's a song that has been used in many, many films. I know it fits the era, but it takes you out. Now, one is very interesting. The Sound of Silence by Simon and Garfunkel. It's a song that one of my oldest brothers really loved, and he was really captured when we watched the films. He really liked that song. And I think it took him out of the movie, but it also made him love the movie even more. So again, it's a double-edged sword. I feel those two songs were the only instances that I can find where like this film drove away from the great soundtrack. However, it is a shame because, the pre-credits introduction features Unforgettable by Nat King Cole in such a way that I picture the comedian's demise every time I hear the song in public, which is cinematic brilliance and the aim of all artists. Now, one thing that you can tell from people is, the song The Times Are Changing by Bob Dylan. Again, it's one of those songs that everyone has used lots and lots of times. However, in the nerdy circle, the Watchmen song is referred to as The Times Are Changing because of this movie. Philip Glass provides two songs that are perhaps now symbolically associated with Watchmen. Pruitt Igoa and Prophecies have now become very, very iconic Watchmen songs. I mean, you can Google it or go to YouTube and you'll find those. Now, there are two songs that are not wholeheartedly owned by the film, but are used extremely well. One of them is Hallelujah by Leonard Cohen. This song occurs just at the right moment in the film and has enough levity after such a long period of, acute dread. It was just like everybody in the film was just like put on trance, and when the song comes up, it's a nice relief. I know it's a pun. The second song that I really enjoyed is All Along the Watchtower. Now, people have used Jimi Hendrix in this particular song lots and lots of times. However, here the guitar chords start to pick up the pacing of the film as the film heads into the third and final act, confronting a literal watchtower in Antarctica, where the antagonist is indeed watching. So it's very befitting. And, as a bonus, there is another song by Leonard Cohen, First We Take Manhattan, which many people in the audience, when I went to see this on cinema many times, they said, wow, they even have a Dr. Manhattan song. They didn't know that it was a previous song recorded, and it was brilliant, So that's why the soundtrack, only has like a 0.5 taken away from them. But overall, it's fairly enjoyable. Cinematography, 1 out of 1. Now, although this film was always praised for its visuals, they never really go that much into detail about what they mean by that. And they often just refer to Zack Snyder's dark films. And they neglect the great cinematographer himself, Larry Fong. I gained much respect when the film came into my home and I was able to adjust the contrast. Because quite often cinemas save money, like movie theaters always do, and all the things, but especially with the film projectors light bulbs. Those are expensive to replace. So a dark film ends up being a dark gray in cinemas, because cinemas save money by not making high contrast, not making work that light bulb hard. So 4K televisions and 4K discs and players have fixed this issue because the color scheme of a great cinematic masterpieces have actually shown what they're really worth. A recent example is Blade Runner 2049. So much credit goes to Larry Fong for making this film look as beautiful and a great cinematic enjoyment as possible. For instance, both the director and cinematographer have gone to great length to just use one camera in such a large production. This forces the framing of the film, and it, kind of adheres consistency. Those who were put off by the slow motion don't realize that's the filmmaker's translation of panels from comic books into film, and makes you, the audience, spend more time looking at something the way bigger panels in comic books tend to do. I recall the movie Hulk by Ang Lee trying to play around with this notion of creating live panels on cinema. Some people hated it, some people loved it. Again, this is a methodology that was used in 300, to stretch long periods of time. In comic books, multiple panels of the same image, slowly, changing here and there, kind of give you the impact of slow moving time and slow motion. Or like comic book that uses 2 pages to tell you a giant scene can also be translated to slow motion. Now, the cinematography here was so beautiful that there were several books detailing all the visuals in this film. Everything from the portraits, the making of, the art of the film, because this film is very rich, not only in costumes, but also the sets, that level of detail. They even created special newspapers, and you can actually read the entire article on cinema because of the 4K cinematography. One of the beautiful things about this film is not just seeing the costumes come alive, but also they use giant sets to make New York City become, soaked in rain and becomes vibrant and lived, very, very detailed alternate reality. And you kind of need this level of detail because you will be taking off into the superhuman world with the events that follow, this 80s themed superhero. So Larry Fong not only brings out panels from the graphic novel to life, but adds movement, gravity, realism, and a tactability that, even Dave Gibbons was really impressed with. Story, 1 out of 1. Given that Terry Gilliam intended to change the ending and Alan Moore never seemed to gripe about it to him in the mentioned interview they both had, it's pretty evident the disdain for changing the end towards the Snyder film by men, children online was nothing more than a simple bitchy thing to do. Furthermore, Snyder and Watchmen writers inserting the homage to the Outer Limits indeed signal that they were aware of such a ploy, at the end of the third arc being the result of Alan Moore just ripping off an episode of The Outer Limits and lacking creativity. What the filmmakers decided to do was to take something the USA created and use it against it. Like superheroes and supervillains, like the atomic bomb and the threat of terrorism. So that's one of the nation's biggest concern, somebody using a nuke on our ground. Therefore, everything else in the story is quite the same as it was in the graphic novel. This was the only change, using Dr. Manhattan against us. One of the main things that I was proud of is that the self-proclaimed smart yuppie, this person I used to know, seemed to have trouble following this film's use of alternate history, while my own father, who speaks broken English, actually followed it quite easily. I'm very proud of that. Even my mother loved the film because she understood the visuals and she understood the story. So that was really actually kind of a nice proof, that sometimes things don't need to be explained to you in order to understand it. This is why Zack Snyder, being a visual storyteller, is really adequate for a visual story being told. This film is about an alternate timeline where superheroes basically change everything. The banning of mass vigilantes in the USA during a volatile time is very appropriate. Film to make a statement about power, and the way the story introduces audiences to this is very, very appropriate also. With a beautiful introduction, with the majority of people seem to understand this is an alternate timeline. They use the times are changing. They show alternative times changed by the superheroes. Even the prior scene to this introduction featured all the trademarks of the film will feature, later on. The killing of the comedian introduces elements such as the media, opulence by the comedian, slow motion where there needs to be, highly concentrated, great cinematography, allowing the darks to shine, Easter eggs, hyper-realism in violence, pop culture references. This particular scene was so meticulous, it kind of sets you up. And then the introduction with times are changing kind of goes, okay, it's a restatement that this is an alternate timeline. So the story really, really is well executed here. There's hardly any confusing elements. And the story is easy to follow, after the first two introductory scenes. Every character is given their moment to shine, their moment to make a statement or redemption. Even the smaller roles I mentioned, some small little things here and there kind of catch your interest and you quote it later on. Like you want to hear about Rorschach? I'll tell you about Rorschach. That's a tiny line, but it's amazing. The film, successfully translated the story from a comic book very, very faithfully, and it is also done very tasteful. The film, much like the graphic novel, does have a very dark and depressing and kind of emotional story, and both the book and the film take a lot out of me when viewing it, take a lot out of my soul, but they also enrich me too. So, they're both impactful in their own way. Script, 1 out of 1. The first 30 minutes or so are basically the entire chapter of the graphic novel, or the first issue, if you're going by that measurement of the series, The film does omit a few things, such as like the two detectives working the murder of the comedian. That plot line is kind of shortened and disappeared for cinematic purposes. In the book, there's a lot of subplot there. Along with the original ending, and everything leading up to the Outer Limits homage or ripoff, inspired ending, however you want to call that. With the giant alternate dimension octopus, that being filmed somewhere, and, all that jazz. This reviewer found the theatrical cut, director's cut, and the Ultimate Edition to be quite fine. Although my favorite of all is the director's cut because it includes more footage and not the pirate anime tale that I often skipped when rereading the graphic novel. That's my personal choice, Now that's the thing about quality and taste. They don't have to be the same if you get a coherent, fact-based reasoning, and you also know what you like. Because to me, the pirate and the giant alternate dimension giant octopus feel like a distraction. to the core hero group, the Watchmen. But, it kind of felt like binge filler material in modern times, like when you dump the entire season of a series and they're just gonna have filler. That's what it felt like. However, the script writers, David Hayter, who also wrote X-Men 1 and X-Men 2, and Alex Tse, they both focus more on the main crime busters group, the heroes of the story. In the graphic novel, these new heroes in the 70s, early 80s, the team go by crime busters, in the graphic novel. The Watchmen were the original team, with the original, Sally Jupiter and Captain Metropolis and everybody else. Now, in the film, both teams kind of go by that. In the title sequence, you kind of see Watchmen, the original group, Watchmen, the other one. So, they're not called the crime busters, but it's a little thing, it doesn't really distract the viewer at all, but that's one of the things it's really subtle, but it kind of shows you that that's what they're focusing on. They're focusing on the characters, making Dr. Manhattan a weapon, in the new ending. It seems better to me because it fits more into the story and makes the story onto the characters themselves, without the whole ripping off homage thing. It's a tighter script, more cohesive, and, managed to adapt the core of the graphic novel really well. So that's why it gets a 1 out of 1. Acting, 0.75 out of 1. Now, many men children online hated the second Silver Spectre's actress, Malin Ackerman, way of acting in this film, simply because they perhaps don't know women outside of Buffy and other TV shows when they wrote the scripts back in the day. It's interesting that a lot of these head geeks and gods of nerdom have been accused of sexual harassment because they wrote stupid crap like this. Now, the core actors in this film are really great and bring their A game. The soul of the team for me is Patrick Wilson, who plays Night Owl. His character embodies every comic book reader's dream of being a fan of a particular hero and becoming the second iteration of said hero. Jeffrey Dean Morgan's performance as a comedian is the stuff of dreams to any actor because the role is quite meaty, yet the actor takes it seriously and adapts it very, very somberly into a character that has depth. Billy Kudrup was very monotonous as Dr. Manhattan. Many of the same men children called it online as boring, yet this is exactly how the character acted in the book, and he was meant to act like this. Except that Kudrup brought emotion when the scenes required it. For instance, the transformation machine, when he became Dr. Manhattan, features some of his best, spazzing out. Same thing with Leave Me Alone. When he disappears everybody in the audience. But two scenes speak to me more. The miracle scene on Mars. His acting really kind of pierced through the CGI. It was really, really beautiful. And also the ending. Oh man. That one really pierced through me, through my emotions. Matthew Good was actually really good as Ozymandias, that I often hear his voice when pictures of the characters come up online. He plays it with such a regal and correct attitude. The whole I am right attitude, that he understands the character all too well. There's even papers saying, articles saying that, comic book movies where the bad guy was right, and they always put Ozymandias there. Now, the acting here got negative 0.25 points. a quarter. Because some of the smaller parts in the films where the actors seem to just do an okay job, you know. And I hope people don't take it personal. Janie Slater's character, there were a couple of scenes where it seemed a little bit like soap opera. Same thing with Wally Weber, and the actor who played it. They were just kind of self-aware that they were in a movie to give a really good performance. But that's kind of a shame. And that's sad because even the actor who played Moloch, Matt Frewer, he had an amazing scene. Like every actor is given that one scene to be like, okay, shine. And this actor, he was very emotionally and really good delivery. Especially when he goes in that scene where Rorschach confronts him. The cancer you eventually get better from. That ain't the kind of guy. I mean, that is such a powerful, moving scene, and it's only a little vignette. Same thing with the original Sally Jupiter. She has a lot of really strong scenes that just screams superb acting. There are many, small part actors that are wonderful. Like Doc Roth, the actor John Shaw, who played him. The news vendor, comic book vendor, played by Jay Brazeau. Even Danny Woodburn, who plays Big Figure. They all did parts great. So it's only like, few actors here and there who may not have taken the movie seriously, who brought it down a little bit, but all the core actors are really great. I don't know, but that's what my logic brain tells me. However, it doesn't really diminish the entire film, but the way we're grading it just did a little bit. Sound. 1 out of 1. Tyler Bates wrote an amazing soundtrack for the film, which often goes ignored due to the audiences believing the entire film is made up of songs by popular artists. But, the film does have an amazing soundtrack. For instance, Tyler Bates collaborated with director Zack Snyder in Dawn of the Dead and 300 prior to Watchmen. And if you heard the amazing soundtrack for 300, which, while doing my research, I discovered is one of the 21st century's biggest selling scores. I mean, that's a great thing to brag, So you kind of know what kind of level of quality this composer can achieve. The first song that caught my attention at the level of quality was, the little guitar strings that starts playing out when Rorschach walks out of Night Owl's hideout, where he says, "You quit." "You quit" is actually the name of the song. A second song, Edward Blake, the comedian, is one that plays a beautiful melancholic pieces in this film, and I found myself in the theater going, "Whoa," out loud when the comedian montage plays and you hear those beautiful chords of guitar. Something a little bit more bombastic and badass is found on Rescue Mission. It's one of the tracks that got me giddy, because not only does it work really well for the scene, but it sets up the excitement, of heroes going to rescue somebody. Like, that was really cool. The one that really haunts me to this day is the title, All That Is Good. It's a song that plays towards the end of the film, where everything is resolved in Antarctica. There's a simple guitar chord followed by a chorus that ties everything together. It's a very short song, and it's the death of a very important character. The melancholy and powerful message of the film in a single track. This is what I would call, this is Watchmen in a nutshell. Now, as I wrote on the methodology about how I grade films, this portion also tends to include the special effects sounds, which are amazing in this film, especially for the Night Owl ship. Voiceover work, really great for, Rorschach, who speaks through a piece of cloth, and Dr. Manhattan, who has to do a lot of voiceover work. The Foley work is amazing. one of the things that I noticed is that I saw the film in IMAX, and the amount of sound information was completely overwhelming compared to the regular cinema. For instance, I was hearing leather jacket sounds in a scene where there's a riot. Now, whoever said Zack Snyder doesn't know what he's doing is disrespecting him and the many talented people that he employs. This is one example of many. Direction, 1 out of 1. During the promotional material behind the scenes footage for the film 300, comic book writer and artist Frank Miller praised Zack Snyder for faithfully adapting such a short graphic novel. Snyder said it was a difficult task because of all the logistics involved with, filmmaking, from making the armor to doing the digital paintings to, doing all the storyboards and, many of which he did himself, Now, they were both being interviewed, Frank Miller and Zack Snyder together, So Miller used this opportunity and quip back, "Oh yeah? How you're gonna handle Watchmen?" Snyder laughed, covered his face, and said, "Oh God." Good joke. Everyone laughed. And you can tell that Snyder was really into Watchmen. The misconception is that back in the day, in order to be into comics, you had to look like a comic book guy. Or, you had to be like an outsider like Tim Burton, be all gothy and stuff. Or kind of nerdy like Sam Raimi, who directed the Spider-Man trilogy. Or kind of like a Hollywood royalty that, wears nerd crown like Joss Whedon, So when a person like Snyder comes along who doesn't look the part, many people disrespect him and call him a bro because he's fit. He's got a square jaw, comes from a military family, he's from the Midwest. I mean, that's the thing. It's like, but when the said person, Zack Snyder, says that he used to love showing the graphic novel to his dorm roommates, many of those men children can't seem to freaking cope. Now, I say this basic information because at the time, only two things really seemed to piss off people about this movie. One, that it was directed by Zack Snyder, and two, it was too faithful to the book. However, if you take away who directed it and look at this film as a standalone cinematic attempt, it stands up to modern scrutiny. And, it's better than most modern day films. When a superhero film breaks records due to inflation and looks more like an episode of a season finale series than an actual film, you kind of get concerned for the death of cinema at the hands of one greedy corporation. Kind of like Adrian Veidt in this film. So Snyder found a way to stretch comic book panels into a film by slow motion, give superheroes a serious R-rated center stage before hipsters decided it was cool, and filmed the unfilmable graphic novel in the spirit of, 80s classic like, Blade Runner, RoboCop, and the Terminator, just kind of like balls to the wall. He has to be applauded. Now, in conclusion, for me, this film is a 10 out of 10 on a personal level, and it's my top superhero film. I think I have problems with favorite because, my childhood has many, but it is my top superhero film currently. Now, I wanted to apply my methodology to see how well it stands up to scrutiny, and it does. And it's refreshing to see how my opinion can differ to the methodology for this film review and others. The original reviewers online were going against the bias against Snyder. They kind of followed the bias but went against Snyder anyways. They cautiously missed out on some good material from the graphic novel because most critics, while they did reference the graphic novel, they did not include actual examples. I mean, other than Wikipedia can tell you. For instance, just like the critics never mentioned Ultimate Comics Iron Man when reviewing the first Marvel Cinematic Universe film, Iron Man. They never really singled out specific panels, lines of dialogue, or errors from the graphic novel Watchmen to the critique itself of the movie Watchmen. Now, the scores back then also included many first-time viewer ratings on this film. And on a film that is layered, people tend to miss out a lot of things, such as with Lord of the Rings or Harry Potter, to anybody who hasn't read the books. A lot of people find answers upon second and third viewings. So here's also where there's the issue. We have subsequent versions of Watchmen, and that were deemed superior to the theater version because the critics were not being assholes the second or third time viewing it. They actually paid attention. They analyzed what's on screen versus what's on their minds and their hearts. They basically had to get over their initial bullshit in order to give it a good review or to have a good taste or understanding. It's like if you associate alcohol with frat drunken a-holes in Cancun, you're going to be like, ew, alcohol, as opposed to having a, adult person enjoying a glass of wine that costs like $1,000. This is why we need more film studies courses in college. This is why we need more film degrees and English degrees for anybody who's making film critiques. Currently, uneducated film critics who are lazy and write about film are schooled by film fans. That's not okay. It turns out, who watches The Watchmen? Well, we do. Anyways, this film gets a 9.5 out of 10. Thank you for watching. D2C at DC.